Elijah in the wilderness. After the death of Solomon, his son Rehoboam became king of the Israelites, but the tribes of the north had not been happy for a long time. Now I know that you are a man of God. Under the rule of Solomon, they had been subjected to high taxes. They thought that things might get better now, but their hopes were soon dashed. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier, their new king told them with satisfaction. So the tribes rebelled against their new ruler, and soon the kingdom was split in two once more, with Israel in the north and Judah in the south. In time, Omri became the king of Israel, and he made Samaria the capital. He made an alliance with Phoenicia through the marriage of his son Ahab to Jezebel. She was the daughter of the ruler of Sidon, and she encouraged her new husband to worship her god Baal. When he became king, Ahab built temples and altars to the pagan god. The prophet Elijah foretold what was in store for the people of Israel because they had turned away from the Lord. He said that there would be a drought lasting for many years, and with it, famine. Elijah went to King Ahab in Samaria and warned him, "As the Lord the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word," he said. And God spoke to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan River. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there." Elijah did just as God had told him and lived happily by the stream, being fed by the ravens and drinking the water. All around, the crops failed and the people began to starve. But then the stream dried up, and the Lord said to Elijah, "Go at once to Zarephath in Sidon, and stay there. I have commanded a widow there to supply you with food." So Elijah went to Zarephath in Sidon, the land where Queen Jezebel had come from. As he approached the gates of the town, he saw a woman stooping down and gathering sticks. Elijah went up to her and greeted her. "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I may have a drink?" he asked her. "And please, if you would be so kind, bring me a piece of bread." She shook her head. "I don't have any bread," she said. "All I have is a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. It is hardly enough for me and my son as it is." "Don't be afraid," replied Elijah. "Make a small cake of bread for me, and then make something for you and your son. The Lord will make sure that the flour and the oil do not run out until the rain comes." The widow looked at him doubtfully, but did as he said. And sure enough, her flour and oil did not run out, and there was plenty of food for her and her son and Elijah until the rain came. But some time later, her son fell ill, and no matter what the woman did, he got worse and worse. Finally, one night he stopped breathing completely, and she said to Elijah, "What do you have against me? You have let my son die, and you call yourself a man of God?" Elijah looked at her calmly and told her to give him her son. Gently he carried the boy upstairs and laid him out on the bed, cold and still. Then he stretched over the little boy 3 times and cried, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." And immediately the boy's chest started moving and the color returned to his cheeks. His eyelids fluttered as if he was waking up from a dream. Finally he stretched and opened his eyes. Elijah carried him down and gave him to his mother. "Look, your son is alive," he said. The widow could not believe it and clutched the boy to her tightly. "Now I know that you are a man of God," she cried to Elijah. Ravens. In the Old Testament, ravens were considered dirty, but God gives these creatures a purpose by sending them to feed Elijah. They ensure that he does not go hungry, proving that even the most humble creature has a part in God's plan. Understanding the story. God brings drought and famine to punish the Israelites, but also to demonstrate his power over Baal, the pagan god of rain. In the face of this disaster, the people suffer greatly. The prophet Elijah never loses his faith in God, and as a result, his supply of food and drink never run out. When the woman blames Elijah for her son's death, he brings the boy back to life in the name of the Lord, and she then shares his belief in God. Oven. Clay ovens speeded up the bread-making process. Before that, people spread the bread on clay molds over the embers of a fire and used metal lids to cover it. Animal dung or grasses were probably used as fuel. Jezebel at the window. This carving is thought to depict Queen Jezebel staring out from her palace window. King Ahab had the palace built for her at Jezreel. The fact that the prophets of Baal ate with the queen shows that Baal worship had become the kingdom's religion. Elijah and the prophets of Baal. The drought in Israel had lasted for 3 years. It was punishment from the Lord because the Israelites had been worshiping the pagan god Baal. Mount Carmel. The Carmel is a mountain range that stretches from the Jezreel Valley to the Mediterranean Sea. Mount Carmel rises to 470 feet or 143 meters, overlooking the sea near modern Haifa. In ancient times, it was lush and green with oak trees, olive groves, and vineyards. The prophet Elijah went to see King Ahab in Samaria again. Ahab greeted him rudely, saying, "Is that you, the troublemaker, the thorn in Israel's side?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," replied Elijah, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed Baal. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal who eat at Queen Jezebel's table." Ahab sent word and summoned the people and the prophets to Mount Carmel. Elijah stood before them all and said, "You cannot worship both God and Baal. How long will you waver between them? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But nobody said anything. Elijah continued, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 of them. And although there were so many of them and only one of him, he challenged them to a contest to see who the true God was. The prophets were to make an altar to Baal. Then they were to place a sacrificial bull on top, but they must not set fire to it. He would do exactly the same, but his altar would be to the Lord. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and we will see who wins," he said. "The true God will set the fire on his altar alight." He let the prophets of Baal go first. They called their God's name from early morning till the middle of the day, and they danced around and around the altar they had made. But there was no response. The wood on the altar remained unkindled, and the calf lay on top of it uncooked. Elijah could not resist taunting them. "Shout louder! Perhaps he's deep in thought." So the prophets shouted louder and louder and slashed themselves with their swords and spears until they bled, as was their custom. By evening they were exhausted, and there was still no response. The altar to Baal remained unlit. Then Elijah called everyone over to his altar, but it was in ruins, so he repaired it. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, and rebuilt the altar. He arranged his wood and cut his calf into pieces and laid them in position. When this was done, he asked for several large jars of water to be poured over the altar until it was soaking wet. The Revival Sacrifices of Elijah and the Priests of Baal, 1545, by Lucas Cranach the Younger. He stepped forward and spoke. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Answer me, O Lord, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God." Immediately the sodden wood on his altar burst into flames, crackling around the sacrifice and leaping high in the air. Everyone gasped in amazement and fell to the ground, crying, "The Lord, he is God! The Lord, he is God!" Elijah gave orders for the prophets to be rounded up. "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let them get away," he commanded. And the 450 prophets of Baal were taken down the mountain and slaughtered in the Kishon Valley. Meanwhile, Elijah walked up the mountain with a servant, through the olive groves and the oak trees. When they reached the very top, the great sea lay like a sheet of silver at their feet. Elijah asked the young man what he could see. "I can't see anything," replied the servant, "only a clear sky and a calm sea." "Look again," said the prophet, but again the servant could see nothing. Elijah asked him the same question 7 times, and it was only then that the servant replied, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." And immediately Elijah told him to go to Ahab to say that the rains were coming. As he spoke, the sky grew black and the wind roared wildly, bringing the rain with it. Ahab rode off as fast as he could to his home in Jezreel, but Elijah, filled with the power of the Lord, ran ahead of Ahab. Understanding the story. The local pagan god was called Baal, meaning master or possessor. God was unhappy that the Israelites were worshiping Baal, so the drought continued. The prophet Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to a contest. He gives his opponents every advantage, so when they are defeated, the Israelites are witness to God's power and superiority. "O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God." Palace relic. A number of relics were discovered in the remains of King Ahab's palace. According to the Bible, the palace was adorned with ivory. Finds include ornate ivory plaques and sculptures. This piece from the palace, of a human-faced sphinx, possibly used as a decoration for furniture, dates between the 8th and 9th centuries BCE. Naboth's vineyard. There was a vineyard next to King Ahab's residence in Jezreel, which belonged to a man named Naboth. Ahab had eyed it enviously for some time. Vineyard. This Assyrian carving depicts a king and queen enjoying the fruits of their vineyard. Supports lift and guide the vines up off the ground. There were many vineyards at that time. The first biblical mention of wine came in the story of Noah, who planted vines after he left the ark. "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is so close to my palace," he said to Naboth. "In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or, if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth." But Naboth refused point blank. "The Lord forbids that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers," he replied politely. He could not even think about it, as, according to the laws of Moses, Israelites were not allowed to sell any of the ancestral lands that had been allotted to them after the conquest of Canaan. Ahab was furious and headed back to his palace in a rage. He lay on his bed with his face to the wall and would not talk to anyone, sulking like a little boy. His wife Jezebel came in and could not understand why her husband was lying there on his bed in the middle of the day. "What's wrong with you?" she asked. "Why won't you eat anything?" To begin with, he did not respond, but finally he turned over and told her about the vineyard. Jezebel looked at him in disbelief. "And you call yourself king of Israel? I ask you?" she sneered. "I'll get that vineyard for you." Ahab turned back to face the wall. Jezebel knew exactly what to do. Without delay, she sat down and wrote dozens of letters, forging Ahab's signature and stamping them with his own royal seal. She sent them to all the elders and nobles who lived in the city. In them, she said that there would be a day of fasting, which showed that someone had committed a serious crime. Naboth was to be seated in a prominent position among the people, and she told the elders to make sure that two good-for-nothings, who could be bribed to do anything, were seated opposite Naboth. They would set him up, testifying that he had spoken against God. This was a crime that carried the death sentence. The elders and the nobles did as they were told, thinking that they were carrying out King Ahab's orders. And the two villains, happy to earn their money, sat opposite Naboth and brought the charges against him. "That man, sitting there, has cursed both God and the king." And Naboth was taken outside the city and stoned to death. When Jezebel heard that her plan had worked and that Naboth had been killed, she rushed to Ahab to tell him the good news. "Get up! The vineyard that you wanted so much is yours. Naboth is dead." Ahab was delighted and went straight to the vineyard to inspect his prized possession. But the Lord had already spoken to the prophet Elijah, and he was there waiting for Ahab. "You have murdered a man and stolen his property. And the Lord says that, just as the dogs licked up Naboth's blood from the roadside, so they will lick up yours. You have sold your soul and have done evil in the eyes of the Lord, and so disaster will fall on you and your descendants, and dogs will devour Jezebel by the walls of Jezreel." When Ahab heard these words, he was appalled and deeply ashamed. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted. God saw that he was truly remorseful, and he spoke to Elijah again. "Because Ahab has humbled himself and is truly sorry, I will not punish him, but I will bring disaster on his descendants." Understanding the story, Naboth's relatives were given the land of the vineyard after the conquest of Canaan. Moses' law stated that the Israelites must not sell any ancestral land. By conspiring to have Naboth accused of blasphemy, his death is a certainty. Jezebel and King Ahab are both to blame for Naboth's murder. Ahab shows remorse, but God's punishment is passed down to Ahab's son, Ahaziah, who dies childless, so ending Ahab's dynasty. The bountiful land of the Jezreel Valley was the setting for Ahab's palace and Naboth's vineyard. The Lord says that just as the dogs licked up Naboth's blood from the roadside, so they will lick up yours. Chariot of Gold. Elijah is taken to heaven in a fiery chariot, seen in this panel above from the altar made by Nicholas of Verdun at Klosterneuburg Priory, Austria. Chariots were usually used for either ceremonies or battles. In war, two men took their positions in the chariot. The driver held the reins to control the horses, while the soldier took aim with a spear or bow and arrow. In the story, the chariot is made of fire as it has been sent by God. Elijah's final journey. The prophet Elijah was walking with his disciple Elisha. He knew that his life was drawing to a close and that the Lord would soon take him up to heaven. "I have to go to Bethel now, but you stay here," he said to Elisha. But Elisha protested. "As surely as the Lord lives and as long as you live, I will not leave you." So they went on together and arrived in Bethel. The company of prophets who lived there came out to meet them. They greeted them both and said to Elisha, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Golden Chariot. This golden chariot was made in the Persian Empire about 500 BCE. It was part of a treasure hoard found in what is now Tajikistan. "Yes, I know," replied Elisha, "but do not speak of it." Then Elijah told him to stay in Bethel while he went on to Jericho. Again, Elisha protested. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as long as you live, I will not leave you." So they left Bethel together and went to Jericho. When they arrived in Jericho, the prophets who lived there met them and said to Elisha, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," replied Elisha, "but I would rather not speak of it." Then Elijah told him to stay in Jericho while he went on to the Jordan River. Again Elisha protested, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as long as you live, I will not leave you." So they left Jericho together and traveled to the Jordan. When they got there, 50 prophets stood at a respectful distance, watching them. They stopped by the edge of the river. Elijah took off his cloak and rolled it up. Then he bent down and struck the surface of the water with it. Immediately the river divided, and a path of dry ground stretched in front of them. Elijah and Elisha walked across together until they reached the other side. Then Elijah said to Elisha, "What can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "What I would like, more than anything in the world, is to follow in your footsteps and be your spiritual heir," Elisha replied. Elijah listened and was silent for a few moments. Then he said, "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet, if you see me with your own eyes as I am taken from you, you will get what you have asked for. Otherwise, not." At that moment a chariot of fire appeared between them, pulled by blazing horses. It separated them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha watched him disappear, and that was the last he saw of Elijah. Elisha wept and tore his clothes in grief. He picked up Elijah's cloak, which had fallen to the ground, and held it closely to him. Then he went back to the banks of the river and rolled the cloak up tightly, just as the great prophet had done not long before. He struck the water with it, and once again the river divided, and a path of dry ground stretched in front of him. He walked back to the other side, and the company of prophets who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting in Elisha." They went to meet him, bowing low on the ground. Jordan River. When Prophet Elisha parts the waters of the Jordan River, it is reminiscent of other biblical stories in which waters behaved miraculously to allow a safe crossing. The Jordan River stops flowing when the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant to Jericho, while the Red Sea divides to allow the Israelites to leave Egypt. Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Understanding the story. Elijah's time on earth is over, and disciple Elisha, meaning God is salvation, will be his successor. Elisha is to be Elijah's spiritual heir and literally takes up Elijah's mantle when he picks up the cloak left by Elijah. Elisha will continue Elijah's ministry. The whirlwind that carries Elijah up to heaven is another demonstration of God's colossal strength and power. Shunem. The town of Shunem lay 3 miles or 5 kilometers north of the town of Jezreel in the rich and fertile Jezreel Valley. Shunem was situated along a busy road. Elisha was a regular visitor to the town. Shunem was also the base camp for the Philistines before they waged war on Mount Gilboa. Elisha and the woman of Shunem. Elisha often visited Shunem in the beautiful valley of Jezreel. Whenever he was there, he was invited to dinner by a rich woman and her elderly husband. Girded loins. When Gehazi placed his robe between his legs and under his belt, he is described as girding his loins. Manual workers like this man in Bangladesh still do this in order to give them more freedom of movement. The woman knew that Elisha was a prophet and a holy man of God. "Let's make a little room on the roof for him," she said to her husband. "We can put a bed and a table in it, and a chair and a lamp. We will make it comfortable for him, and he can stay there when he wants to. It will be a home from home." Elisha accepted their hospitality gratefully. One evening, as he was resting on his bed, he thought how lucky he was. He called his servant Gehazi and said, "How can I repay your kindness?" "The woman has no son, no children at all," replied Gehazi, "and her husband is an old man, too old to father a child. She would like a son more than anything else in the world." Elisha asked him to fetch the woman immediately, and she came and stood in the doorway. "About this time next year," Elisha told her, "you will hold your very own son in your arms." The woman could not believe her ears, but sure enough, about 1 year later she gave birth to a baby boy just as Elisha had predicted. The woman still could not believe it, and every day she gave thanks to the Lord for blessing her with a son. The child grew healthy and strong, and life was good for the family. But one day the boy went to find his father, who was supervising the harvest in the fields. The boy clutched his hands to his head, howling in pain. "My head! My head! It hurts so much I can't bear it." His father ordered one of the servants to carry his son back home as quickly as possible. By the time they got back to the house, the boy was almost unconscious, and the servant gave him straight to his mother. She tried to revive him, but he lay there as white as a sheet. His breathing became shallower and finally stopped altogether. His mother sat weeping. Then slowly she took him upstairs and laid him gently on the bed in Elisha's room. Forcing back the tears, she went to her husband and said, "Quick, I need a donkey and one of the servants. I am going to fetch Elisha." Moments later she set off for Mount Carmel, where she knew she would find the prophet. When she reached Elisha, she bowed down before him and clutched at his feet, crying. His servant Gehazi came over to push her away, but Elisha rebuked him. The woman told him what had happened and that her son was dead. Elisha listened and said to Gehazi, "Tuck your cloak into your belt. Take my staff and run back to Shunem as fast as you can. If you meet anyone, don't stop. Whatever you do, when you get there, lay my staff on the boy's face." Gehazi did exactly as his master had told him, while Elisha followed with the distraught woman. But when he laid the staff on the boy's face, nothing happened. So Gehazi rushed back to tell his master. When Elisha reached the house, he climbed the stairs and went into his room. The boy lay on the bed. The prophet shut the door and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay on top of the boy. As he stretched himself out, the boy's body gradually started to get warm. Elisha got up and paced to and fro across the room. Then he went back and stretched himself on top of the boy again. At once, the boy sneezed loudly 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and told him to fetch the boy's mother. She peeped fearfully around the door, and Elisha smiled and said, "Take your son, he is alive." She gasped and rushed in, thanking Elisha from the bottom of her heart. Then she went to her son and put her arms around him. At once the boy sneezed loudly 7 times and opened his eyes. Understanding the story. Now Elisha has the spiritual powers of Elijah. He must put them to good use. Elisha performs twice as many miracles as his master did, and many of them benefit ordinary people. This reflects God's concern for all. The boy sneezes 7 times as he is brought back to life, and this number represents perfection and completeness. English painter Frederick Leighton's Elisha Raising the Son of the Shunammite, 1881. Syrian king. Syrian craftsmen used tusks to make ivory carvings. This Syrian king is believed to be Hazael. During Hazael's reign of 37 years, he waged war with the Israelites. Elisha and Naaman. Naaman was a commander in the Syrian army. He was a brave soldier and was highly regarded by his troops. Leprosy. Naaman's skin condition may have been leprosy. This bacterial infection causes damage to nerves in the face and limbs, sometimes resulting in the loss of parts of the body. At the time, leprosy described many types of skin complaint, as people could not differentiate between them. But Naaman suffered from an affliction which made every inch of his skin white and scaly. It itched and stung, tormenting him from morning till night, and he knew that people avoided him when they could. Recently, a young girl from Israel had been taken captive by the Syrians, and she became the maidservant to Naaman's wife. The girl was horrified when she first saw Naaman and said to her mistress, "If only your husband could see the prophet Elisha in Samaria, he would cure him." That evening, Naaman's wife encouraged her husband to go to Israel. He agreed and went to the Syrian king and asked him if he might be relieved of his duties for a while. "By all means go," said the king. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel asking him to cure you." The next day, Naaman left for Israel, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of the finest clothing. He was not sure how much it would cost to cure him, but he was willing to pay anything. When he finally arrived, Naaman gave his letter to the king of Israel. But as soon as the king had read it, he erupted in fury. "Why does the king of Syria send someone to me to be cured?" he stormed. "He is just trying to pick a quarrel." Naaman wished he had never come. But when Elisha heard about this, he sent a message to the king. "Tell the man to come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Naaman went straight to Elisha's house, but Elisha did not come out to greet him. Instead, he sent a messenger to tell Naaman to wash himself 7 times in the Jordan River, and he would be cured. But Naaman was not happy. "I thought that he would come and wave his hands over me and call on the name of the Lord, and that I would be cured," he said. "The rivers in Damascus are just as good as the Jordan. I shall go straight home and wash myself in the waters there." But his servant stopped him. "Master, if the prophet had told you to do something important and difficult, you would have risen to the occasion, wouldn't you? All he wants you to do is to bathe in the waters of the Jordan and be cleansed." Naaman listened and reluctantly agreed. He went down to a deserted part of the river and waded into the water. He submerged himself completely, 7 times, and then came out. As he stepped onto the bank, he looked down in amazement. His skin disease had completely disappeared. Naaman went back to Elisha and said to him, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Please accept a gift of thanks." But Elisha declined. "In that case, would you give me as much earth as my 2 mules can carry so that I can take it back with me and worship the God of Israel on Israelite soil?" asked Naaman. and Elisha agreed gladly. But Gehazi, Elijah's servant, thought that his master should have accepted a gift from Naaman. So, filled with greed, he went back to Naaman and pretended that he came with a message from Elisha. "My master has had a change of heart," he lied. "He wants me to tell you that there are two young prophets who have just arrived from Ephraim, and they would be grateful for anything you could give them. Maybe a talent of silver and a set of clothing each." "By all means," said Naaman. He tied up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags and sorted out 2 fine sets of clothing, and he insisted that his servant carry them back for Gehazi. But, as soon as Naaman went out of sight, Gehazi grabbed the silver and clothes and sent the servants on their way. He went back to his own room and hid his ill-gotten gains under the bed. Then he went back to Elisha. But Elisha looked him straight in the eye and said, "Is this the time to take money or accept clothes, or anything else for that matter? The skin disease that used to torment Naaman will now be yours. It will cling to you and your descendants forever." Gehazi watched in horror as his hands and arms and toes turned scaly and white. He felt a terrible itch creeping up his legs and spread across his back. Naaman's affliction was now his. Understanding the story. The miraculous healing of the Syrian soldier is an example of God's love and care extending to other nationalities. Again, the number 7 features and is symbolic in its meaning of perfection and completeness. Naaman bathes his sore skin 7 times in the Jordan River and is cured. Though a foreigner in Israel, he rejects his local gods in order to worship the Lord. After submerging himself 7 times in the river, Naaman's skin is totally cleansed.